Quite a while ago, I used to go to a lot of 12-step meetings, and I want to tell you a story about a guy that we met there because it kind of illustrates what we're talking about today. So we were going to these meetings, and this guy showed up, and none of us knew him because the group of people we had been kind of going to the same meeting for a long time, and we knew each other. So when someone showed up we didn't know, it was kind of obvious. And he came in, and everyone's welcome. But when he came in, he sat down, he crossed his arms, and he just sat there. And this is usually not a good sign. He didn't talk the first meeting at all, which is fine. You don't have to talk in a 12-step meeting. It's not required. But the second meeting, the third meeting, it was all the same. He would show up, cross his arms, sit there, never talk, and then at the end of the meeting he would leave. Now, he was there, I mean, on time for the start, and he stayed to the last minute, but he never really participated. Well, this went on for about 6 weeks, and then he stopped showing up. So, not knowing him or ever heard anything about him, we just thought he took off and we weren't going to see him again. But it was a few months later he came back, and this time when he showed up, it was a whole different body language. He came in, instead of crossing his arms, he actually kind of leaned forward, he looked down, and you could tell he was really, heavy burden. Something was really weighing him down. And this time he started to open up, and that's when we began to hear the whole story. The first time he came, he was there because he was required to be there by the courts. He had been pulled over for like his third DUI, and so they said he had to attend 6 weeks of a 12-step meeting. So he was there, and again, on time before the start and all the way to the last minute, and we could say he was physically present, but he wasn't really there. You could say he was there, but he didn't show up. And the second time he came in, he told us that in between those times, he had lost his marriage. His wife had left because he had not stopped drinking. Nothing had changed. And the pain of the loss of that relationship was what motivated him to come back. And in that place, he was now not just physically showing up. He was present. He was showing up emotionally, spiritually, and things happened there. In that place, things began to change. So I want to tell you that story because it illustrates what we're talking about in this topic about you hear a lot, our biggest job in Christianity is to show up. You just got to show up. And you hear that a lot in books and other things, but you hear a lot from the platform, from preachers and pastors preaching. You'll hear them say, we need to show up with God, and what does that mean?
Right. Well, I actually got to thinking about that fairly recently because what does it mean to show up? Well, when Brett was pastoring a church, he would preach on the weekends, of course, and occasionally I would take a weekend and preach. And Brett's main message when he was preaching about having a relationship with God was to just show up. And my main message that I always tried to get across was there's just one thing God wants you to do, and that's to love Him and to love your neighbor. But really, those two things walk hand in hand, because when we just show up and we are honestly and truly present with God and willing to hear what it is that He wants to tell us, and then believe that what He wants us to do is actually better than what we want to do, now we have shown up, and we receive the power to be able to love our neighbor like He asks us to do.
Yeah, and again, we're trying to define that, what does it mean to show up? Because like, you're right, when I was preaching stuff, one of the things I used to say was like, there's two lists. There's God's job, and that's one list, and there's our job, and that's the other list. And how many things are in each list? And without fail, people would always list. I do this a lot in Bible class. I'd ask my students, what do you think's on our list? What do you think's on God's list? And without fail, the students would always have this tremendous list on our side. It's ours, and a very few things on God's list. And it's really the opposite. What we were saying was that, no, everything here is God's. The only thing we have is to show up. And again, what does that mean? Well, like Miranda just said, the difference between showing up like the guy did at the beginning of that 12-step meeting versus how he did it at the end, one thing made the difference, and it was a willingness. A willingness to be open, to hear what God has to say, whether we want to hear it or not, to receive what God wants to give us, whether we want it or not. And, well, you were using the idea of loving God and loving your neighbor, And I don't know where you live, maybe Mr. Rogers' neighborhood, but some of us live in places where it's not so easy to love our neighbor, especially where we
currently
live.
love our neighbors.
Yeah, we do love our neighbors, but other people, not us, but other people. The idea of sometimes having to, do good to your enemies, you love people around you when it's really hard, but that's something God asks us to do. And in that place where we show up with our devotion, and that's what God's putting on our heart, that whatever it is, loving your neighbor, whatever it is, if we're open and willing to listen and accept, then whatever it is God has asked us to do, He will give us what we need to do it. Even if at the moment it doesn't feel that way. That's the big thing, and that's where faith comes in. I may not feel the power of God at the moment. I may not feel like doing what God is asking me to do, but I believe that when it's time, God will give me whatever it is I need to do it.
Right, that's right. And really, our relationship with God is many times characterized as a marriage relationship. And here on this earth, when people are married, occasionally things start to head south. And right before things are ready to crash into the ground, and the whole thing is going to come to an end, many people try to rescue that relationship by going to see a counselor. Well, there are times when only one person in the relationship actually wants to save it, and they show up with a heart that's willing to do whatever it is a counselor is going to ask them to do, because he sees the bigger picture. He's seen this sort of situation more often, and he can see it with more clarity than we can. And so one person shows up with a willing heart. The other person will sometimes show up in body, but not in spirit, because they've already decided that maybe, they are right, and it's the other person that wants to change, or that needs to change, and they're waiting to be vindicated and be told that they're right, and it's only the other person that needs to change. And I know Brett's had a little bit of experience with in his family about that.
Yeah, my parents divorced a long time ago, and my mom told me the story years later. But they did. They went to counseling, and my mom was the one that, really was the motivation to go to counseling. And my dad went along, and in the counseling session, she told me that, they were pouring their, different differences out and their things and everything, and the counselor was listening. And when it came time to, ask my dad, you're like, well, what are you willing to do? What are you willing to change? What are you willing to give up? Whatever. My dad was just very much nothing. I like the way I am, and I like the way things are going, and I don't care. I don't want to change. And it was in that moment that the counselor, well, okay, could you give us a second then? Let me talk to your wife, And that's when he said, get a divorce. There is no hope, because he doesn't care. And it's really interesting, because I'll ask, again, in my Bible classes, I'll ask kids, what is the opposite of love? And without fail, I get 90% going, hate. And I was like, no, that is not true. Hate is not the opposite of love. Apathy is the opposite of love. So again, in a marriage situation, a counseling situation, if you got, two people who hate each other, you got hope, because there's emotion there, and you can get into what's behind the anger and the hate. But if one person doesn't care, you're done. They just don't care. They're apathetic. And that's another way to show up without actually showing up. And like you're saying with the marriage thing, one person goes in for change, the other person goes in to justify themselves, like, I'm going to show you how I'm right, and the counselor's going to tell you you're wrong. I wonder sometimes if some people, any of us, go into a devotion, even knowingly or unknowingly, with the motivation of justifying ourselves. Right.
I was just thinking that there's all kinds of reasons, no doubt, to show up in the presence of God. We feel like we need to. So we must do that in order to be a good Christian. Or we show up to, you're right, justify our wrongs.
And to explain to God how horrible this person was to me, and why I'm justified in not loving my neighbor.
That's right. Yeah. And so there are more reasons than one to show up in the presence of God. But God only wants us to show up. Well, I don't care. I mean, no doubt he wants us to show up at all times for any reasons. He'll gladly listen to us, but he really wants us to have the willing heart, because he wants so much to give us that more, that better that he promises us. And we can only receive that when we are willing to say, you know what, God, you are right. No matter what I think, no matter how I feel, you are right. And just, we need to ask for his power to repair us, repair our broken relationship with him, and he will gladly do that for us. And we need to do that on a regular basis, because we are constantly, our pride within us is constantly causing us to stumble and sin, and we are in constant need of God's help in repairing our relationship with him.
Yeah, and so that's right, something you just said about God doesn't care how we come, just that we come. And that's true. A lot of times the reasons, the motivations that drive us to God, they don't matter. It's just that it brings us to him. A lot like going back to this original story, the guy, when he first showed up, was there physically, but not in any other way. It was the pain and the loss of his relationship, of his marriage, that drove him back to the 12-step meetings. It was the pain of that loss that broke him, if you will, that made him able to be open to what he could learn and then heal in the meetings. And I think God sometimes allows us to experience the pain of our consequences of our own choice, that pain will drive us to him. We have a saying in 12 steps, people don't generally change till they hurt badly enough. And sadly, that's pretty much how humanity is. When we're uncomfortable enough, then we'll change. But if we're not uncomfortable enough, life's pretty good, I'll just keep cruising along. And there's a story in the Bible that I think really brings the whole thing here we're trying to talk about home. The story of Peter and Judas. So if you look at the story of Peter and Judas, they're in the last days. Peter denied Christ, the story of the rooster crowing, and there 3 times he denied Jesus. But Judas also denied Jesus in his betrayal. So both these men did the same thing. They both denied, betrayed Jesus. And yet, their outcomes are very different. Peter was reinstated and became an amazing apostle and a huge, spiritual influence and person in the Christian church, and Judas hung himself. Well, what made the difference? The one thing that made the decision between one of them living and one of them dying was one of them ran back to Jesus. One of them ran back to be in his presence. And it's one of my favorite stories in that it was after the resurrection, Peter and the disciples were out fishing, and it was the exact same experience that was the first calling of Peter to be a disciple. Okay, so in the first thing, they were all fishing, and Jesus was preaching on the shore, and he said, hey, cast your nets on the other side. They did. They caught all these fish, and he goes in, and he gets called to be a disciple. After the resurrection, the exact same thing. They're out there fishing. Jesus is on the shore, and they say, throw the nets over the side. They get all these fish, and Peter instantly knew it was Jesus, and he jumps into the water, doesn't wait for the boat, doesn't wait for the paddles, and I guess he dog paddles to shore, and he gets up, and he falls to his knees in front of Jesus. And mind you, he hasn't seen Jesus since the betrayal. This is his first time seeing him again. So imagine, put yourself in that place. What would you be thinking? What would you be feeling? The last time you saw this person, you betrayed him. And here he just did a miracle that's the same miracle he used to call you. That's not lost on Peter. And he falls to his knees and just looks at him. He doesn't know what he's going to do. He doesn't know what's going to happen. All he did was throw himself in the presence. He didn't walk in. He didn't stride in. He threw himself down because that's all he could do. And then I think Jesus' response was pretty cool, because Peter, who knows what Peter's thinking of what he's going to get what he deserves. And Jesus says, you look hungry, I made you breakfast. And then after that was the process of bringing Peter back and the healing, if you will, of bringing Peter back into being a disciple. It didn't matter how he got there. He got there. He did the only thing he could was throw himself in the presence of Jesus, and everything happened from there.
There's some more that Jesus did for him.
Yeah.
Nothing more that Peter did.
No.
There was nothing. Peter did nothing.
No.
but show up.
He showed up.
And then Jesus did everything else for him.
Yeah. Fed him physically and then spiritually. And that's really the basis of what we're saying. That's what it means to show up. If sometimes all you can do is throw yourself there, being in that place, being willing and open to take whatever God has to give you, just like Peter. He didn't know what it was, but he was willing to take it. That's what it means to show up and be present, and everything else happens from there.